All right, a very good afternoon, everyone. It is now 2 minutes past the hour. Welcome to the webinar. More of you and more of your colleagues will continue joining over the next few minutes. But for now, I wanted to take this opportunity to welcome you to the second in our series of webinars, which we are organizing in partnership with the African Development Bank on the topic of safe and efficient urban mobility for Africa. Perhaps a number of you joined us last week for our first webinar on designing and delivering robust traffic impact assessments. For today's webinar, we will be addressing the important topic of safer cities with a particular focus on vulnerable road users, non-motorized transport in particular. Donc, un mot de bienvenue à tous nos participants francophones, et nous savons que vous êtes nombreux, et nous sommes ravis de vous accueillir à ce webinaire. D'un mot pour vous rappeler qu'une interprétation est disponible vers le français. J'en profite pour remercier nos interprètes. Vous avez le choix de la langue au moment où vous rejoignez le webinaire. Vous pouvez également changer de langue, de mode linguistique tout au cours de la réunion en utilisant les réglages qui sont offerts sur la plateforme Teams. Et d'autre part, je voulais également vous assurer que toutes les questions pourront être prises indifféremment en anglais ou en français. So with this said, we are together for just over an hour, between an hour and 30 minutes, depending on how many questions we receive. You are very welcome to ask questions throughout the session using or share observations, reactions, and personal experiences using the chat feature. And at the end, of course, we will leave plenty of time for questions, and you will have the opportunity to open your microphones and perhaps share insights and ideas about what you have just heard. I want to highlight that the event is being recorded. You will receive a full copy of the recording as well as the presentations that are being shared today. Let me also encourage you to take a moment through the chat box in particular to let us know which city you are joining us from. It's last time we tried the survey, we got very interesting responses. So hopefully we will get similar insights into the cities and the countries that are deeply concerned by this topic of the safety of vulnerable road users. As I mentioned earlier, this this webinar has been developed in partnership with the African Development Bank, which has been a long-standing institutional partner for African cities. And the bank works in many ways to improve the lives of citizens throughout the African continent, but it does this in particular through the Urban and Municipal Development Fund, which some of you may be familiar with. The fund is involved in providing expertise on integrated city planning. It works with cities across the continent to also provide and prepare a pipeline of well-prepared, sustainable urban projects at a time when many of these projects are becoming more complex. And lastly, the bank, through the fund, also provides capacity building for municipal governance, through which, in particular, this initiative is made possible. And I'd like to take this opportunity to salute the work of the bank and to welcome, in particular, our colleagues from the African Development Bank who are on today's webinar. I will be sharing in the chat a link with additional information about the Urban and Municipal Development Fund, but there's definitely a platform which we would encourage African cities to take a close look at and see if they may be eligible for support through the UMDF. Just to recall, for those of you who did not participate in the orientation webinar, or indeed in last week's first webinar on traffic impact assessments, this program is designed to provide capacity building as well as mentorship services to help you as African cities formulate city-specific and shovel-ready, as we like to say, strategies. The program covers 4 areas, which are listed here. And as you can see, today we are covering designing safe cities for public and non-motorized transport. Just a few words about the workflow. How are we delivering this program? Well, we have an ambitious timeline, as you can see. We started with an orientation webinar, which led to initiating 2 separate tracks, one focusing more on let's say, traffic engineering disciplines in the context of fast motorizing cities on the African continent, and the other focusing on traffic safety. And as you can see, these are both organized through two separate webinars. So for those of you particularly interested in traffic safety, please note that we will meet again on March 8th, where we will progressively transition from the type of engineering and design good practices, which we will be covering today, to leadership and safety strategies at the urban level for African cities. And those of you who follow this program are all very welcome and invited to join us in Accra, the capital of Ghana, on the 25th of April, where we will have instructor-led workshops and an opportunity to assist you in designing these implementation-ready and city-specific action plans. So why Accra, I hear you ask? Well, in part, largely in part, in fact, because this is where we will be holding our next IRF Africa Regional Congress. We know that some of you have already expressed interest in delivering presentations, and we do in fact have a call for abstracts that is currently open until 1 week from now, so still a few days to put that together. It will be held at the Accra International Conference Centre over a period of 4 days, and the first day will be focused on these instructor-led workshops. And I want to highlight that all cities and government agencies participating in this program of webinars will have complimentary access to the full Congress. So we'll be providing you with additional information about the options to participate in this event and really bring this program to a close together. In terms of setting the scene, and here I will be relatively brief, it is a topic that many of us sadly, tragically in many cases, are confronted with. Urbanization and indeed the growing motorization in African cities brings a host of challenges, as we know, and one of these key challenges is to provide safe mobility services for Africa's citizens. This arrives in a context where we know that road traffic fatality rates are already much higher on the African continent than anywhere else. And these figures translate to 650 deaths per year, half of which are not drivers of vehicles, but are pedestrians, cyclists, and motorcyclists. The type of vulnerable road users will be spending more time thinking about and concerning ourselves with during today's webinar. These figures should be a matter of concern and consternation, frankly speaking, for all of us. But let me borrow from the words of Jean Todt, who is the, many of you are familiar with him. He is the, or at least I've heard of Mr. Todt and his inspirational role as the high-level representative at the United Nations for Road Safety. So Africa, and I'm sure all of your governments, took part in the formulation of the Sustainable Development Goals, and indeed the second UN Decade of Action, more recently in 2021, to halve road deaths by 2030. And we are not on this trajectory currently. Investing now in safe and sustainable mobility across Africa will be a game changer for the continent's bright future. It is time to get moving. And it is on these inspirational words again that we'll now hand over to our track champion and today's speaker and great colleague and friend of ours, Dr. Jean-François Giselle. Jean-François is a civil engineer with expertise across transport planning, traffic management, ITS, road design, active mobility, and road safety. He has been active for more than 35 years in over 30 countries, many of which are on the African continent. He's also the president of Engineers Without Borders in Quebec and the executive director of the Transportation Association of Canada, as well as a member of the board of the TAC Foundation, that's the Transport Association of Canada, and the Quebec Transport Association and Order of Engineers of the Quebec Foundation. Jean-François is also a regular speaker and instructor at IRF events, and it's very much a privilege to have him with us today. So Jean-François, without further ado, I would ask you to perhaps open your camera and mute yourself, and I hope I have set you off on the right track for your presentation today.
Thank you, Brendan. Hello, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. It's a pleasure to be with you today. We'll be talking about designing safe city for public and non-motorized transport. So you can hear me well, Brendan? That's fine.
I can hear you just fine.
Very good, thank you. Um, just a few words in French for my African colleagues. So je parle français aussi, bien sûr. J'ai travaillé beaucoup en Afrique et c'est un sujet qui me touche particulièrement. La présentation va se faire en anglais, mais je pourrais prendre vos questions en français. On pourra répondre en français si vous en avez par la suite. Donc, je vais passer à l'anglais. Et comme le disait Brendan, vous pouvez écouter la présentation directement en anglais ou via les interprètes qui vont vous la traduire en français au fur et à mesure. So I'm going to share my screen and so we can get moving. It's going to take a few seconds. So Brendan, do you see my screen? Is it okay?
I can confirm we see your screen. Thank you, Jean-François.
Very good, thank you. So today we're going to be, I'll go through a quick introduction and I'm going to repeat a few things that Brendan already said. We'll talk about the African context, which is very specific. We'll focus obviously on vulnerable users. And there are two concepts that I would like to talk about. The first one is speed management, and we'll look at, how do we manage speed and what are the best practices? And we'll be looking at traffic calming concepts. Many of those are being used in Europe and in North America. How can we apply those to the African cities? That's what we'll be talking about. Possible applications, and it's not easy. I do understand the cultural difference with African cities and the difficulties being either in terms of organization, finance, behavior. It's not an easy task, but I think we can, through these kind of webinars, we can start thinking about changes and how to do it. And the goal here is to get just a mix of ideas so we can brainstorm and start moving slowly, and hopefully I'll help you structure the thought about all that. So in terms of introduction, and Brendan said it, I'll go very quickly about this. So we got two main tracks. I'm on the right hand side here of the slide, which is a green track, which is a road safety one. And the first webinar, that's where we are today. So we'll be talking about engineering for designing safe cities for vulnerable users. And eventually we'll jump to the other one. So the rationale, as Brendan said, the rationale between those webinars and the upcoming workshop in April in Ghana is the challenges that Africa is facing towards fast urbanization. There is a real need for safe and efficient mobility, and we've got plenty of tools in terms of technology, traffic management systems. And the point is, how can we use them? How can we deploy those to help African cities being safer and more efficient in terms of transportation and mobility? And one way of doing this, obviously, is sharing best practices from around the world. And to this point of view, IRF is a beautiful platform. IRF can bring different perspectives, different speakers from all over the world, sharing what they've done, both good and bad. Very often we learn more by failure than by success. So we can talk about things that do not work, and so we would avoid repeating those in other countries. At the same time, I see this as an opportunity to alter the status quo, so we can really transform Africa's urban mobility landscape by getting into action. So that's what we're going to be doing today. So this first webinar, we'll be talking more about engineering. The next webinar in March will be about Vision Zero and the kind of strategies, political requirements that would be necessary for implementing Vision Zero for African cities. So we'll be talking, as I said, about planning and engineering, and we'll be focusing on vulnerable users, which are pedestrians, cyclists, transit users, and motorcyclists. We'll be talking about those as well. We'll review best practices for those, and we'll try to analyze what could be applicable for the reality of African cities. And we'll explore what can be learned from other cities while shortening the learning curve, so we can leapfrog a couple of steps. The first webinar, this one today, will be exploring more the threats for life that are facing a wide number of road users in African cities. And I think that's very important. Being a vulnerable users, the key word here is vulnerable. How can we protect pedestrians, cyclists from being hurt by heavier, faster vehicles? So we need to look at their needs. They need to be able to go from point A to point B in a safe manner. We'll talk about that. How can we separate VRUs from heavier and faster vehicles? How can we set up appropriate speed limits? Putting a speed limit which is not appropriate, which is not credible, which is not in relationship or in coherence with the road geometry doesn't make sense at all, because it won't be respected. So that's something we'll be looking at. And also we'll look at different street guidelines and how can we apply them. But first, I'll just spend a few minutes talking about the stats about the African context and road safety. Even though Brendan talked about it, it's good to look at that in more detail. So today, or in 2025, most of the world's biggest city are in Asia. We're talking about Tokyo, Shanghai, Delhi, Dhaka, but by the end of the century, it's going to be in Africa. That's where the biggest cities are going to be concentrated, within the next 50 or 60 years. And so it's going to highlight even more the necessity to have safe and efficient mobility, especially for vulnerable users. The road safety stats for low-income country is really unacceptably high. It's a leading killer for children and young adults, and over half of the victims are VRUs. So there is progress which is being made. The problem is that it's not uniform. For low-income countries, and several of those are in Africa, there is absolutely no reduction in death since 2013. And the death rate is 3 times higher than anywhere else in the world. So Africa and low-income countries, not only Africa, but in most of low-income countries, it's about 1% of the world's total vehicles, but it's around 13% of the road fatalities, which doesn't make any sense at all. There is no coherence here, and we'll look at why. So when you look at the world, you see the distribution of deaths, and when you look specifically at Africa, you realize that over 40% of the deaths are pedestrian, which are vulnerable road users. And actually, Africa and Southeast Asia have the regional rates of road deaths higher than the global rate. It's over all the rest, as you can see here on the left-hand side for Africa. It's way above, and those numbers were already presented by Brendan in his introduction. But we are at 26 in average, 26.1 deaths by 100,000 K. What's interesting is that within Africa itself, we can see a difference between middle-income country and low-income countries. And as countries get richer, the number of deaths is decreasing because they can implement more strategies, and they've got better funding for working on pedestrian vulnerable user safety. So what I did is I just wanted to focus on the African culture, and there is here, as you can see on the right-hand side, the ESRA, which is a survey which has been done on road users' attitude, and I looked at that, and I pulled out a couple of major themes which I thought were interesting. So vulnerable users, there are more pedestrian, car passenger, and taxi users in Africa because of the lower prevalence of car ownership. That's just an obvious fact that we need to keep in mind. Distraction is really a problem for many countries, and it is also in Africa. Many vulnerable users are distracted by listening to music through headphones or using mobile phone while walking or cycling. It's a major problem in many countries. Using a cell phone while driving is prohibited in many countries. It is. I'm Canadian. I'm from Canada. It's we are not allowed to phone and drive. In many other European countries, it's getting prohibited because it's too distracting. Okay, and many accidents are due to distraction. Speeding, I was surprised to look at this fact, but it seems that African drivers are driving less, slower actually than European. This is self-reported, by the way, data, but that driving slower, not car drivers, but not motorcyclists, which seem to be exceeding speed more often than European countries. Impaired driving, that is driving under the influence of alcohol and drugs, it is about similar in Africa and Europe, and the World Health Organization estimates that about between 5 and 35% of all road deaths are related to alcohol intoxication. So that's something to take into account as well. Distracted driving, I talked about it, but in African countries, about half of the car driver are reporting using their phone while driving, and a third of the motorcyclists use their phone while riding, which is absolutely crazy. I mean, you when you do use your phone or try to call someone, you get your eyes off the road, which is something that we should never do when we drive. Passive safety is another issue for Africa. The effectiveness of seat belts, airbag, helmets in preventing and reducing fatal or serious injury has been proven. However, many Africans are reporting not wearing seat belts, and especially in the back seat. And mainly this is due to a lack of regulation, limited technical inspection of cars, outdated vehicle fleets. And about half of the African motorcyclists report not using a helmet, and we can see that I mean, many of the people listening to this webinar are African, so you know what I'm talking about. But I'm always amazed. I'm using a motorcycle myself, and I would never think about riding my motorcycle without a helmet. It doesn't make any sense to me. But I do see a lot of Africans doing that, which is really scary. Actually, that's something that could be solved quite quickly, even though it's passive safety. So let's look at vulnerable users more closely. As we said, about half of the road deaths are among VRUs. So Africa has the highest proportion of vulnerable user deaths in the world. When we look specifically at pedestrian and cyclists, globally, it's about a quarter of all deaths. In Africa, it's close to half of the deaths. So what's impressive here is that despite the predominance of road deaths, VRUs are still largely ignored in the planning, design, and operation of roads. And that's what we'll be focusing on today. How can we put VRUs in the center of what we do? How can we do human-centered design and think about human before anything else? And that's what we'll be trying to do today. As we said, this is an opportunity to alter status quo. What can we do to improve safety in African city? Well, the first thing we should do is make the best use of the existing road network by managing and controlling traffic activities. There are ways to manage traffic and control traffic activities. By doing that, it's a first step. Before doing any design or anything else, that's one of the first steps we should do. The other one we should do is make sure that VRUs have practical, safe, and efficient mobility solutions. When they have to walk right on the road because the sidewalk is not usable, or because there are obstacles, or because it's not well drained, it's putting them in danger. So we need to make sure one of the solutions is providing efficient and safe mobility solution for VRUs, and we'll look at how to do that. Another thing we should be thinking about is maintaining and increasing the modal share for non-motorized transport by making the transit user experience easier and safer. If it's difficult to catch the bus, or if the bus stop is at a place where it's dangerous, people are not going to be using it. Moreover, sometimes we can see the transit system is not efficient itself. The buses are not mechanically maintained properly. They are overcrowded. They drive too fast. So this is something we should look at also if we want to increase safety. And the last point is improve the efficiency and safety of all transportation mode. At the same time, we should try to think about the environment and minimize the footprint. That's one of the beauty of Africa. A lot of people are using active transportation, which is fantastic. It's good for the health and it's good for the environment. Now, how do we do it in a safe manner? That's a question, and that's a difficult one. So let's look at a couple of facts about VRUs when we talk about them. As you see, I did add the motorcyclists because they are part of the vulnerable users. One of the characteristic of a VRU is the lack of external protection. So when they get hit, they get all the impact on themselves. They suffer the most severe consequences of crash because they cannot protect themselves against speed and mass of other vehicles. I mean, we'll look at it a little further, but speed is killing people. And if nobody were moving, we would not have any crash, obviously. And when you have vehicles or you have something around you that can protect you, the vehicle can absorb some of the energy when there is a crash. So it's going to fold the metal, it's going to absorb some energy. But if you're a pedestrian, that's your body which is going to accept the all the energy transfer, and that's what's causing injury and death. So walking is the most common transportation mode in Africa, and this is why a large part of African road users are categorized as VRUs. So I put a couple of pictures here that you're going to see. I just want to show you that a pedestrian can have different faces. It can be a children, it can be someone with a bicycle, it can be someone on a skateboard, it can be a jogger running, it can be an elderly person, kids going to school. There are all kind of vulnerable users, and they do have different characteristics. And we look at them now. As you can see on the picture here, you see different people, and they have all of them different physical and cognitive characteristics. Some have limited vision and hearing, slower reaction time, lower level of attentions, slower walking speed, cognitive limitations. So we need to take this into account when we design our system. We cannot take the average walking speed of anyone. We need to look at specific clienteles of pedestrian for specific areas we are working on. Another point which I thought was interesting is that there is no exam or qualifying test to become a pedestrian. Anyone is a pedestrian. So you do have people walking on the street that have no clue of the rules of the road because they don't know. They don't know the sign, they don't know the marking, they don't know what the traffic light is looking like, and but they still are road users. So we need to take this into account. As I said, pedestrian distraction is a major issue. We'll come back to it, and that's something we should look into if we want to improve safety. I just to say a few words about children pedestrians because they're very specific. They do have a different behavior from adult pedestrian. We need to take that into account. Their own perception of safety is not very well formulated. They don't realize danger the way an adult does. Their idea of critical behavior is not very well developed yet. You can see here on the picture a kid which is running between two parked cars because his soccer ball is rolling on the road without looking at, is there any car coming up? The focus is fully on the ball and not on anything else, and that's typical from children. They do have also greater difficulty in judging speed and distances. They're not very good at that. So they might think that they have time to cross the street when they do not actually, because the upcoming car is coming very fast. Also, they are smaller than an adult, so they don't see. When you have a kid that, as we can see on the picture, that's coming up between two cars, you cannot see him. You would see an adult because the top of the body would be over the roof of the cars, but a children like this, you won't see him or her. So the best way to improve child pedestrian safety is to keep them away from the road and making sure they've got somewhere to go, because if there is no space, they're going to go on the road. And the other point, which is interesting, is that we should not direct messages to them. We should direct safety messages to the approaching motorist. That's why we do have specific notes about school zone and playground where we tell motorists watch out for kids, because the kids won't watch out for themselves. So we need to warn the motorist in advance, letting them know that there are kids playing around, there are schools, and the more we inform motorists, the better the motorists can adjust their speed. Some of them won't do it because they don't care and they don't look at traffic signs, because we do have people like this. But most people tend to look at signs and respect them. So if we tell them, watch out, there is a hospital coming up and you should reduce speed, that's a good warning. And then we should implement traffic calming devices. Could be speed bump, could be some kind of narrowing, markings, things that reinforce the message that there is danger ahead and they should slow down. Same for cyclists. There are different types of cyclists and a variety of skill set, limitation, and capability with cyclists. Usually the the cyclists do ride on the same road network as vehicles, but they are also unlicensed. There is no exam or qualification for a cyclist. So we don't know if they know the rule of the roads, and some of them do not. Many of them, especially in North America, and I think it's a bit the same in Europe, but in North America, especially in Canada, surprisingly enough, a lot of cyclists do not respect the rule of the road. They go through red lights. They go on the wrong way of the road when there are one ways. They just take it the wrong way. They drive on the sidewalks, and they're quite dangerous actually. And they are very much involved in accidents, obviously due to their own faults. So one of the main issue with cyclists is that they just disregard traffic regulation in general. Cyclists are at fault in about 50% of all crash with motor vehicles, sign violation, riding against traffic. They're in danger when they share the road with motor vehicles, especially trucks and bus. They can go very very close to cyclists on the road, but at the same time, when they ride on the curb or on sidewalks, they become a danger for pedestrians. So in all cases, it's a strange mixture. They can be in danger themselves, or they can represent a danger for others. Children cyclists, I'm talking about them, but they don't control their vehicle quite well, and they are less aware of danger, as I said. So we need to take this into account as well. And like we said, pedestrian cyclist distraction has become a major issue. I just took a picture, as you can see on the screen here, which I find absolutely crazy to see this young man here riding his bike. He's absolutely not looking at the road. He's not hearing anything because of his headphone. He's looking at his cell phone. That's a danger for himself and for anybody else. Why do we call them vulnerable? Because they don't have the ability to withstand the force of impact. At 50 kilometers an hour, a vehicle impact is the same as falling from a 10-meter high wall. It's hard to imagine what this is, so I'll show you a picture. Pedestrians don't realize when they're walking on the curb or crossing the street that it is exactly the same as being next to a 10-meter deep hole adjacent to the curb. So if we could, as you can see on the slide here, if people could see a deep hole right next to them, they would be scared. They would not get close to it. But we don't see them, we don't realize it, so we just walk on the street very close to the car, and people get hurt. So we should know that and be aware of that. How do we improve pedestrian safety? Well, the best way to do it is to manage kinetic energy. Yeah, I don't know if you know the formula, but one way of doing it is obviously to reduce the speed differential between vehicles and vulnerable users. The less the speed differential, the less likeliness of an impact of injury and death. So I made a little picture here. For example, if there is an upcoming vehicle at 30 kilometers an hour and they see children crossing the street, it's going to take about 8 meters the reaction time for the driver to step on the brake, and to stop, it's going to take another 5 meters, which leads to 13 meters, and it would stop in time. At 50 kilometers an hour, it's not going to work because it's going to take 14 meters to react and another 12 meters to brake, which is 26 meters, meaning they're going to drive over the kids. And that's what it's all about. That's why we're talking about reducing speed. It's making a lot of difference. The slower the vehicle, the more chance you have to avoid crash. And if there is a crash, the impact is going to be less. That's what I'm going to show you on this here. At 30 kilometers an hour, your chance of survival is 90%. At 50, it's going down to 20%. At 70 kilometers an hour, you have no chance of surviving because your body cannot sustain the impact. You are going to die, for sure. So that's why we reduce speed and we push on reducing speed near schools, near hospitals, near areas, playgrounds, where you have pedestrian activities. This is one of the things we should look into when we talk about African cities, making sure that, because there are a lot, and we'll look at it in a couple of minutes, but there are a lot of activities alongside the roadways. And you've got vehicles driving by at 80, 100 kilometers an hour, very close to vulnerable users. They have absolutely no chance of survival if one of the vehicle hits one of the pedestrian, which is on the side of the road. So how do we improve pedestrian safety? Well, first we manage speed, and we'll talk about it. So we make sure we can adapt the speed limits to the street function and the local context. We absolutely need to make sure that speed is in accordance to what's happening there. One of the issues of African cities is that you've got national roads that are crossing villages, and the road remains the same. There are straight roads going through, and it just says 30 kilometers an hour. But if the road itself does not talk, if the road itself does not change, or there is some kind of geometric design that shows that there is a difference, people are going to be driving fast, no matter what the sign says. And we'll show you how to do it in a couple of minutes. So we need to make sure we reduce speed around school zones, commercial street, pedestrian areas, crosswalk, hospitals, bus terminal, bus stops, all those places where you have VRU's activities, you need to manage speed. The other thing is signs and marking. We need to make sure motorists are informed about pedestrian activities. Sorry. There are a lot of signs and markings that do exist to warn drivers about pedestrian activities. So we can have crosswalks, and those can be controlled or uncontrolled. We have stop lines, signs for schools, playgrounds, health centers. We need to use those. And the idea is to tell motorists that, watch out, there are vulnerable users. And as I said, some people won't look at that, because some motorists, but most motorists do. And we need to talk to the majority of them. We need to tell people, behave properly. And when it is well done, people do behave properly. The other thing is physical separation. We need to separate the motorized vehicle flow from pedestrian, cyclists, and motorcyclists through overpass, tunnels, curbside barriers, bicycle paths and lanes, dedicated lane for motorcycle. And I'll show you a couple of pictures. All of those actions are improving safety one way or another. And there is no one solution, but it's a recipe of many elements that's going to improve safety. And that's what we look at. So we can implement a lot of small things that are going to improve safety overall through a lot of small actions. Another point is to increase visibility. Very often pedestrians are not seen. And when a pedestrian is hit, one of the things the motorist says very often is that I did not see him or her. So we need to make them conspicuous for motorists. We need to have proper elimination of pedestrian area, higher level of illumination near crosswalks, illuminated bus stops. We need to find ways to make sure that VRUs can be seen. And obviously, the last point, which is not the least, is appropriate infrastructures. We need to make sure that pedestrians can walk safely and away from traffic. We need to design paths and curbsides and areas where they can walk safely. Those need to be large enough. they need to be free of obstacles. So that is, we need to have a space for parking, because if it's full of parked vehicles, it's not going to work. It need to be well drained and well lighted as well. If there are puddle of waters, pedestrians are going to go around it, and they're going to walk on the road to avoid walking, in the water. So we need to have some network that connects a major pole of interest, being commercial, institutional, health, and making sure that pedestrian can go from one to another or reach out to the public transit access point easily. And eventually, another point is universal accessibility. That is allowing people in wheelchair, or people who have difficulty to walk, blind people, deaf people, to be able to walk and use the network, and have proper guidance in order to avoid them being in conflict with motorists. So let's look at speed management in more detail here. Some fact about speed, which is obvious. What I'm showing here is so obvious, but people don't think about it. We should be aware that speed is a factor of all crashes and all injury, and that's obvious. If there is no speed, there is no impact, and if there is no impact, there is no injury and no death. So how do we get the right compromise between mobility and sufficient amount of speed to be able to be efficient and safe, and safe environment? So speeding is associated with both number of crashes and the severity of crashes. It's about 30% of all fatal crashes are related worldwide are related to speed. So that's one area where we can work and do something interesting to improve safety. Speeding could include driving within the speed limit, but still be excessive for the prevailing condition. And we see that very often. That's why actually in many cities in the world, the speed limit in cities is limited to 50 kilometers an hour. While now it has been reduced to 40, and some cities, for example, Amsterdam in Netherlands, is reducing it to 30 kilometers an hour. So we are realizing that if there are vulnerable users, we need to reduce speeds, and we'll see how to do this. Some part of the road should be dedicated for mobility. Those are major arteries, freeways, where vehicle can drive fast. But on those, we should not have vulnerable users. So we should have, when we have vulnerable users in local street, in smaller arterials or collectors, we should make sure that speed is lower. I talked about kinetic energy. I'll come back to it very fast, but many people don't know the formula. But what I would like to show here is that the kinetic energy of a vehicle is proportional to the square of its speed. So the risk of death for a pedestrian is not twice, but it's 4 times greater when hit by a vehicle at 65 compared to 60, because it's not linear. So that's something we should take into account. So reducing the speed from 50 kilometers an hour, where your chance of survival is about 80% of 20%, going from 50 kilometers an hour to 30, you raise your survival chance from 20% to 80%. That's exactly why we talk about reducing speed near school zone and where there are vulnerable users. Also, travel speed affects the driver's ability to accurately and reliably process information. The faster you go, the narrower your visual field becomes. So you don't see as well the roadside. Well, you don't see it at all actually when you drive fast. So you are not able to see danger or hazards or vulnerable users on the side of the road. However, high-level information processing is critical in a demanding environment when there are VRUs. So that's another reason for reducing speed in places, in areas where there are pedestrians, because the driver ability to process information is slower. So speed management is absolutely essential to protect VRUs, as you can imagine. There are several definitions of speeds. I won't go too much into detail, but just to make sure you understand what we're talking about. When we talk about design speed, that's the speed we use as part of the geometric design process to design a road. So it's a speed we use to design the road. It could be 100 kilometers an hour for a freeway. It could be 30 or 40 or 50 kilometers an hour for a local street. Operating speed is a speed at which vehicles are observed during free flow conditions, which is not the same as the design speed. It could be higher, it could be lower, but it's a speed at which vehicles are driving. So, for example, on major arteries in urban cities, very often when it's a wide boulevard, the vehicle speed could be limited at 50 kilometers an hour. But because it's straight, it's wide, there are wide lanes, people tend to drive faster. On the other hand, when you have very narrow streets, the speed limit can be 50 kilometers an hour, but the operating speed is much slower because motorists are afraid of hitting something. It's very narrow, there are parked vehicles, pedestrians, so they tend to drive slower. So it's not related to the speed limit, which is a posted speed we can see here. That's a maximum lawful speed for a particular location as displayed on the signs. Statutory speed is the speed limit established by the governing agency. So, for example, in France, the speed limit for freeways is 130 kilometers an hour. In the Emirates, it's 160 kilometers an hour. In Canada, we take safety very much into account. So the speed limit on our freeways is 100 only. It's 100 kilometers an hour. So it depends on the country. It depends on the governing agency, but that's why pedestrian safety has two levels, and I'll talk about it a little more. So it has to be top down from government has to take into action, but it also has to be bottom up, where we can have local action directly on the street, concrete action to improve safety. And the last point I wanted to talk about is the 85th percentile speed. That's something we use very much in engineering. It's a point in the speed distribution at which 85% of the vehicle travel at or below. So it's considered at the maximum safe speed for a location under good weather and visibility condition. So those are just facts to keep in mind when you do your design, when you think about your own area. How can you improve? You should know those definition of speed and the right one to use. Consequence of speeding for the drivers, there are a few. As I said, it's reducing the visual field. It's reducing the ability to accurately and reliably process information. There is more distance traveled during the perception and reaction time because we are driving faster. Stopping distance are longer, and there is a greater potential for loss of control of vehicles. For the VRUs, there is an increased feeling of insecurity when vehicles are speeding, reduced time to cross the street, reduced time to react to an event, increased severity of injuries and obviously death probabilities in crashes. And for the society at large, and we should take this into account as well, more speeding means more fuel consumption, more noise, more vibration, more pollutions, and that's something we should look at as well. We should keep an environment in our head. So what's happening in speed management currently is that the speed limit used to be aligned to driver preference for high speed travel. As roads were being built and vehicles were more and more performant, people tend to drive faster and faster. It took a long time before we start limiting speed on highways and reducing speed. Before that, it was open. And in some countries, it's still wide open. For example, in Germany, on the Autobahn, you can drive as fast as you want on some sections, which is kind of scary. But at the same time, statistics shows that they don't have more accidents than the average. However, when they do have accidents, they are really bad usually because of the speed, obviously. Another point which is quite interesting is that most drivers tend to underestimate the likelihood of an adverse event that may cause harm. Most drivers don't think about a hazard. I'm traveling quite a bit, and the most dangerous part of my travel usually is between my home and the airport. Even though, that's what I do all the time, driving my car or my motorcycle. But people tend to be more afraid by taking a plane than by driving on the road, because they do it, and they do it so often that they don't see the danger. But you've got much, much more chances at having an accident on the road than in a plane. So that's, people tend to underestimate the risks. Another thing that drivers tend to do is they overestimate what speed is safe for themselves and the others. And they tend to think, that's very interesting. There were many, many surveys on that people do believe that they drive better than others. It's quite interesting. Most drivers think they are better drivers than the average, which is obviously not true. When we see the number of accidents that happen, it's not good. And the last point is that drivers are not good at perceiving many risks, in particular when there is hazardous roadside objects. People are thinking in series, not in parallel. So we can do one thing well at a time, not too many things at the same time. And when there are a lot of action, a lot of stimuli for the driver, they cannot perceive the risk properly. So what should be done? We should manage speed, and the focus is not to lower the speed all over. Despite what I said previously, the idea is not to put everything at 30 kilometers an hour. That's not the point. The point is to match mobility needs with the surrounding environment, the infrastructure, and the safety. And that's not easy to do. So motorist speed is directly influenced by the message sent by the road and the street surrounding. So here we are talking about um, uh, talking about the coherence between geometry and speed. And that's what we do. And I'll show you a couple of examples of how we do this. But we should let the road talk to the motorist. If the road is straight and wide, people are going to drive fast. If it's narrow, if there are obstacles on the road, if there are markings and obstacle that pushes them to reduce speed, they're going to do it much more than any sign or marking on the road. And speed limit must be established to take into account the human biomechanical tolerance limit. It's really crazy to allow the vehicle to drive over 50 kilometers an hour nearby vulnerable user, because the biomechanical tolerance of a human is not, it's not going to work if they get hit. They're going to be injured severely or die. So that's what we need to avoid. So notwithstanding the extent of speeding on our road, surprisingly, the posted speed limit are still acknowledged as being the most powerful mechanism for influencing speed choice. So we should use that. We should post the right speed limit, but not do it by itself. We should complement the posted speed limit with a lot of engineering, with different solutions, traffic calming devices that I'm going to be talking about, that will help you reinforcing the message that the posted speed limit does. So speeding is not driving faster than the speed limit. It also includes not adapting the speed to the local condition. That's important to know. Speed limit setting should take into account the type of the road user, as I said, and the safety quality of the infrastructure. Sometimes the infrastructure does not allow for higher speed because the infrastructure is not in good shape, it's not well drained, and we should take this into account. Speed limits should not only be safe, they should also be credible for road user. That's an extremely important point here. A speed limit is credible if it meets the expectation evoked by the road characteristic of the surrounding. I don't have it with me, but I took a picture of a road in Latin America. I was driving on a highway, which is wide and straight, and at one spot there were one speed sign which said speed limit 30 kilometers an hour, which didn't make sense at all. And I stopped there because I wanted to see if it had any effect, and nobody reduced speed because it doesn't make sense. So people, if it's not credible, motorists won't respect it. We need to make sure it's credible, to making sure we use the right road hierarchy, and we see the difference between mobility and access function. And I'll talk more about this in a couple of seconds. So speed management requires several initiatives: setting appropriate and credible speed limits, adapting infrastructure and road geometry to the targeted speed, and ensuring adequate enforcement of the speed limit. So each road has a specific function. Some are favoring mobility and some are favoring accessibility. Road users understand the road hierarchy and usually they behave accordingly. VRUs and commercial activity must be controlled to reduce the incompatibility of mixed functions. That's very specific of Africa. We should look into that specifically. Road designers and land planners should stop favoring motor vehicles to the detriment of VRUs. That's one of the main trends of perhaps the last 20 years and the decade of road safety has been implementing. We have been focusing very much on motor vehicles. The car was the king of the road. It should not be this way anymore. We should favor much more active transportation. We should protect vulnerable users because it's good for the health, because it's what most people can do is walk and use their bicycles, and it's cheaper and it's better for the environment. So motor vehicles and car, I'm not saying that they are not good and we should not use them, but they should not be in the center of all we do. What should be in the center of what you do with the human? We should have a human-centric design and reflection. That's what my next point here. So road designer and land planner should develop a human-centric approach in their work. We should develop, I'll show you how, we should develop a bottom-up vulnerable user scheme. So start from what the local conditions are, what are the possibilities to work specifically on the local area to improve the pedestrian network, sidewalk, curbs, signing, design, and at the same time we should have we should have a top-down government initiatives and bylaws that will help that. The other thing we should try to do is make the best use of advanced technology. As you know, we are going into Internet of Things. Vehicles are going to be more and more connecting to the road and to other vehicles, and we should use that and try to see how we can use that to improve and enhance mobility and safety, which is quite interesting. So what I'm afraid of, and that's why I wrote this last sentence here, is that we could leapfrog, and because technology allows that. However, it's important to progress step by step. In many African countries, for example, the phone network has not been well developed, and you went directly from not having phone to the mobile phone that is Wi-Fi and going without the fixed lane that we did have, which is fine. But by jumping over that, it's sometimes you are jumping over very important actions. So remember that in the way you work, you need to progress step by step and make sure that you can use experience from others and what they've done, as I said before, on the positive side, but also on the negative side. Road hierarchy, here I show you a quick picture. This is what a road hierarchy is looking like. On the left-hand side, you can see a freeway. You can see it's separate lanes. There are no accesses. Car can drive fast. There are no vulnerable users on the road. So that's what it's look like. On the top center here, you got a highway or main arterial, which is wider roads. You have controlled access. You have traffic light. And usually the vulnerable users are separated. You've got curbs and sidewalks. You've got bicycle lanes. Then on the green here, you've got collectors, which is narrower streets with curbs. You've got parked cars. And eventually you can come to a local street where you can have very specific traffic calming devices you can implement. Here you can see a chicane that help reduce speed on vehicles. The problem that we have in Africa, as you can see on the picture here, there is not a proper definition or separation of activities. You got commercial activities, you got pedestrians, you got parked cars, and you got driving cars here. So roads and street hierarchy is not very well defined in many locations. Very often, national roads cross linear villages without any modification of the road geometric design. So we should warn motorists that you are entering a village, you are entering commercial activities. You should have markings, signs, speed bumps, gateways that will help you, telling people watch out for vulnerable users. Speed limits are not credible due to a lack of coherence between with the surrounding environment. Too many uncontrolled roadside activities along the road, and uncontrolled commercial activities and street vendors that are within the right of ways. That's something that we should look into, and we should try to control. Also, there is an issue with parking space for motor vehicles. They need to stop their car, and very often there is no space, so they do park directly on the road. So speed management process program, how do you do it? Well, you need to identify speeding issues, determine partnering agencies. That's something that should be done in coordination. Identify countermeasures, implement countermeasures, and evaluate the project and program to make sure that it's working. So you go back and once again, you identify the speeding issue. Did you improve it? And how do you do it? Well, you do a site visit. You go there and you look at what's happening. Are there skid marks, damaged infrastructure, worn marking, crash data? Do you have crash data? And do you have people complaints that cars are driving too fast? You should do speed spot check, and you should validate the data. Is it an issue or not? Very often people perceive speed as going too fast, but when you do spot check, it's not going too fast. It's just a perception. You should analyze the coherence between posted speed limit and the surrounding environment. If you have a national road with a speed of 60 or 70 or 80 kilometers an hour nearby commercial activities and vulnerable user, it's not proper. It's not coherent. You should search for unexpected condition or type of activities. For example, fair use presences. You should review the relevance of information conveyed to the motorist about the area. Is the motorist aware of commercial activities and VR use? Is the motorist well informed in advance of a danger? And of course, engineering design, geometry, pavement, signs, signals, marking, and I'll show you example in a couple of minutes of all of what I'm talking about with pictures. Speed management tool, we'll talk about this also in the next webinar, but we should implement a safe approach. And a safe approach is safe road, safe speed, safe vehicle, safe people. It's not only safe road or reducing speed. It's a global approach that takes into account the different elements of the road: vehicle, people, speed, roads, and making sure that all of them are safe. We should make sure the infrastructure, as I said, and I know I'm repeating myself, but I do it on purpose. We need to make sure that the road sends the right message to the road user. We need to help drivers seeing and understanding the risk by posting credible speed limits. So if it's not credible, they won't look at it and they won't understand the risk. We should have awareness campaign. We should enforce the speed limit with police control and fine. And I know that's very difficult in many low-income countries. I know in many countries there is a lot of corruption, and people can easily, instead of paying the fine, give a little money to the policeman and say, okay, let me go, and that's very much linked with the income of the country. I'm fully aware of that, but that's something we should work on. And one way to improve safety is both what we call the carrot and the stick. So the carrot is, we should congratulate people for behaving properly, but we should use the stick to tell them that's not the way to do it. And that's not an easy balance to get, but we should be working on that. We should educate all road users. As I said, pedestrian, cyclists are not licensed. They don't know the rule of the road. We should enforce them and make them aware of of the danger of the road. We should impose vehicle speed reductions through implementation of traffic calming device. We'll be showing that in a couple of seconds. So the way of looking at it is, first we'll start with adequate engineering and design speed. We'll make sure that we have coherent posted speed limits. We need to make sure that all road users are well educated. We need to make sure that we've got proper enforcement, and we should start putting traffic calming device. On top of that, we should have self-explaining roads, the road that's talking to the motorist by themselves. Another point is forgiving road, because we know that people make mistakes. So if a motorist or a vulnerable user does make a mistake, is there a way to avoid a major injury or death? Can we implement physical constraint to make sure that if a vehicle goes off the road, it's not going to fall on the cliff or drive on the curbs or whatever? And the last point is making sure that we've got proper emergency services if there is an accident. It's it's after the fact. The best idea is, of course, avoid an accident, but if there is one, how can we limit the consequence of that accident? We'll talk about all this in the next webinar, by the way. So I'll go through a couple of pictures because I know I'm a bit long. So this example of things that you can implement: advisory speed warning signs, and there are many of those. There are manuals about that, and they do talk to motorists. We can put them on the pavement as well. So it's not only signs that are on the road. In many countries, and I've seen it actually. Road signs are being stolen by people because they need the metal and they can sell it back. And so one way of doing it is painting on the road. It's very difficult to steal painting on the road, whereas it's easier to steal signs. So that's another way of doing it. One thing that's very efficient, and I know it's not easy to implement in many countries, but is speed activated signs. So you show the speed limit and you show the speed of the vehicle. And that's extremely efficient. When people see that they're driving much faster than the speed limit, they're going to reduce speed because by themselves, they believe they are in the speed limit. But if it flashes them, it's going to improve and they're going to reduce speed. Another thing which is working in well is optical speed bar. Those are small bars that are along the road, as you can see on the picture, and that creates an effect of narrowness for the driver. And by instinct, the motorist is going to reduce speed because he's going to feel that it's narrower, and that's something which is quite efficient. So reduce lane width, it's the same thing. It's just make people think that it's narrower, so they're going to be driving slower. Another thing is center island, raised median. So it gives a chance for pedestrians to cross in two parts the road, and while they are waiting in the middle of the road, they are safe because they're on an island and they are somewhat protected. Another thing is road diet. For many years, we've been increasing the number of lanes, and we can see sometimes that in some cities, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Toronto, you got highways of 12, 13, 14 lanes, which doesn't make sense because it's all congestion. So one of the things that we do is, what we call road diet. Instead of having, as you can see on the picture here, 2 lanes per direction, we put 1 bicycle path, we put 1 lane per direction, and we put a center lane when we allow, double left turns. That's one thing we could do, and that helped reducing speed. Roundabouts are very efficient to reduce the number of conflict points. In comparison to a right angle intersection, roundabouts are much safer, and they impose speed reduction as well. Gateways is a way to say, watch out, you are entering a zone where the speed is going to be different. You should be reducing speed. And putting the sign by itself is not going to be efficient. But gateways, as you can see here, where the driver, the motorist, has to turn or can see that the road talk to him or her, makes a huge difference. So gateways those should be used in African countries much more than that. That's one of the best, I think, or the most efficient device that should be used in African city. Let's look at traffic calming quickly. Traffic calming is a design to encourage uniform vehicle speed and improving, safety condition, obviously for VRUs, by implementing devices. So they are usually used on streets or roads where the speed is lower than 50 kilometers an hour. Obviously, you cannot put a speed bump in the middle of a freeway. It doesn't make sense. You are going to create accidents. It has to be in places where the speed is already lower, obviously. So usually it's done in urban areas, or it can be done, or it should be done in rural villages. But if you do this, first of all, you should have a gateway that tell the motorists, watch out, we are going to be reducing speed. You have you need to make sure that the motorists reduce speed before you implement any traffic calming device. They can be speed humps, pitch point, chicanes, or any other way. I'll show you a couple of examples. And the idea also is to discourage through traffics. Sometimes people use local street to bypass congested area, and you want to discourage that by prohibiting through traffic. Also, another point which is important, that should be a community-wide strategy. It should not be a local street-by-street initiative. You should not put a speed bump somewhere on a street by itself. That should be done in a neighborhood-wide vision. Traffic calming solution, I'll show you a couple. Speed hump. So here you can see the picture of the solution, and you can see the drawing on the left-hand side at the same time, a top view. So speed humps, that's very efficient to reduce speed. Raised intersection, we call them sometimes speed tables. So the intersection itself is raised, so that protects the vulnerable users, and it forces vehicle to reduce speed. Otherwise, they're going to break the car. Chicanes. So here you can see driver has to drive around obstacles, what we call chicanes. So he has to reduce speed to go through that, those left and right turns. We can do that through curb extension as well. We just extend the curb, and that provokes some kind of a chicane, or half chicane, perhaps we should say. So that helps very much. All those examples, by the way, are taken from the city of Toronto, which is about 500 kilometers from Montreal, where I live. Traffic islands. So you put some obstacles on the road, and of course, those need to be conspicuous. I mean, motorists need to be able to see them quite well, but that's very efficient to reduce speed. Small traffic circles, it just imposes some kind of movements to a driver, so they're going to be slower by using it. Bumps. In our cities, very often we've got alleys, behind streets. Very often we got alley for services and emergency services, and people tend to use that as shortcuts. So we put bumps so they reduce speed, because very often the kids are playing in the alleys. Curb extensions. Those are two advantages. It reduces the crossing distance for pedestrians, so it's safer. They are less exposed, and at the same time, it permits parking. It protects parked vehicles. On the other hand, so on the previous one, you saw curb extension, but curb reduction is working as well, because the smaller the radius, the slower the speed. When it's almost a right angle, you cannot turn as fast as when the radius is higher. On-street parking, as you can see on the picture, when you got on-street parking, the effect is to reduce obviously the length, the width of the road, so people tend to drive faster. One of the disadvantages of that is that if you've got kids playing on the road, you won't be able to see them. You don't see vulnerable user. So there is some kind of a hazard with on-street parking that should be aware of. We should take into account. Raised median island, I told you about that. So it protects the vulnerable users, as well as narrowing the lanes, the lane width. The directional closures. What we use sometimes is do one-way street, and one way of doing it is just putting an island, and that closes one side of the street. Diverters. So those allow you only to turn on the right or on the left at an intersection. You prohibit all movements. You just separate movements. It is very efficient to avoid through traffic, and it reduces conflicts, obviously. Or full closure. In many cases, they decide to close streets. And street could become completely closed to vehicles, actually, become pedestrian street, and we'll see a couple of examples of that. Raise median through the intersection. It's always working quite nicely. Speed humps, mini roundabouts, traffic circles. As you can see, we do have a lot of devices that we can use. as a traffic calming device. I'll show you application of the African context. That's the last part of the presentation. Before I say that, what are the weaknesses that need to be improved, that we need to work on? Well, one of the things we need to work on, and that's going to be the object of the next webinar, it's the institutional framework for traffic management. It's quite poor in general in Africa, and we need to improve that. We need to have better data. We don't have reliable data on traffic, on safety, on mobility. The more data we have as engineer, the better we can work. There is a lack of demand forecasting and analysis. If we can forecast, and we need data to forecast, if we have data, we can forecast, and we can forecast, we can design. So it's all linked. Traffic impact analysis. That's the other side of the webinars that we are working on today. I'm on the road safety side, but on the traffic impact analysis, which is the other pillar. If we have proper traffic impact analysis for developments, you can right away implement the proper design. The other thing is the famous 3E, which is engineering, education, and enforcement. It's weak in Africa in terms of, all the 3Es actually, both, engineering, education, and enforcement. We need to reinforce that. Obviously, one way of doing it is having more money to do it, so that there are shortage of funding. We know that. There is also a lack of inter-agency or cooperation and coordinations. If agency could work better together and cooperate and coordinate, that would help. And maintenance, infrastructure maintenance, signs and marking would also, it's something we need to work on. So at the planning stage, what do we have to do is develop a coherent and strong non-motorized transport network, implement pedestrian-only streets and urban walking plans, build safe and signalized cycling corridors, enable easy transfer from individual transport and public transportation, implement park and ride hubs for motorized vehicle and cyclists, and reduce inconvenient and unsafe detours for pedestrian and provide safe paths. It looks easy to say, it's not easy to implement, but that's what we should be working on. In terms of engineering, what does it mean? It's improving and expanding signalized pedestrian crossing. We should have more of those and better design and making them more visible. If we can, we should try to use different characteristics for different streets, making sure that the street talk to the motorist and they understand the function of the street. We could use different surfacing for pedestrian space and bicycle paths whenever it's possible. That's very helpful in differentiating, where we can drive and where we should not be driving. Drainage is important for pedestrian area. Very often the pedestrian areas are not well drained and people don't walk in there because they cannot do it. So making sure it's well drained and well lit, that's good. Traffic calming techniques, parking infrastructure and management, and making the best use of technology and data-driven innovation. I already said that. A couple of examples I took from the Manuel de sécurité routière pour l'Afrique. It's a road safety manual that you have, and I'll show you the reference in a couple of minutes. For example, here you see on the top picture, there is no pedestrian facility. The lanes are kind of narrow. It's not well delineated. So, you are going to create a problem. As you can see here, they have physical barrier for pedestrians, good delineation, wider lanes on wider roads. You don't want to have wider lanes on streets. You want to narrow them, but on main roads you would like that. So that's the kind of difference. That's what we should be looking at and trying to look for, aim at. Another thing we should have is a proper functional road hierarchy. As I said, I think on the left hand side it's a picture of Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, and they got a plan to have a proper road hierarchy. And as you can see on the right hand side, the motorbike, and no one is wearing a helmet, and that's driving me mad, but they should be wearing helmets. You can see that motorcycle, they've got their own lane and through physical segregation, which is much safer than having them along with the with the general traffic. Some other example, all those are from Africa, so you can see crosswalks. They can be protected or not. Physical barriers to protect pedestrians, making sure that if a vehicle is driving up the road, they won't get hit. pedestrian overpass, pedestrian island. I'm sorry, my picture are not very clear and not very good. I just copied them from different manuals. Um, Another thing that's working very well is car-free streets or car-free days. Sometimes you say, okay, well, those are going to be a pedestrian-free street. So you can see Kigali in Rwanda. You can see Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. They do have car-free days. Um, Kampala in Uganda, they do have a car-free day. I used to live for a couple of years in Latin America in Venezuela, and in Caracas there is a peripheral road going around the city of Caracas, and on Sunday morning they just close the freeway. It's forbidden to vehicles, and you got cyclists and families walking there and joggers, and everybody's on the freeway. Uh, until noon, and at noon they open again for the everybody leaves and they open for the car, which is quite good, so it gives a place for people to walk safely and do exercise, and I think it's an interesting approach, and as you can see in those cities they can do it in Africa. Freeways, it's important. Sidewalks, here you can see again photo from Kigali and Mombasa in Kenya, where you have sidewalks which are well drained, wide, well lit, people can see it, and that's what we should be aiming at. A bicycle corridor, here you can see the Lebu Jemo corridor. On the left hand side, the way it was before, you can see the cyclists in the middle of the road. Here on the right hand side, you can see they are protected. They've got their own bicycle path, and that's much safer. Other type of solution, roadside activity regulation. We need to regulate roadside activities in Africa. That's one way to improve safety. We should limit or group access. So making sure that where people want to cross the street, we have a crosswalk and we can regroup them at the same spot so that they don't cross all over, and we can do that through barriers or different solutions. We should try to separate cyclists and pedestrians. There are a lot of people injured by cyclists on the sidewalks. A bicycle driving fast, hitting a pedestrian can actually kill the person. So we should be very careful about that. Dedicate lane for motorists, I already talked about that. Service roads, that's one way of protecting roadside activities. We do create a service road which is alongside the main road. So on the service roads, you can have more activities and vulnerable user, and you avoid having them on the right road. And of course, speed control. And that I think that the last physical calming measure that's coming from South Africa. So you can see raised crosswalk and traffic roundabout that can be used. So in conclusion, what do we need to do? As I said, we need to make the best use of road network by managing and controlling traffic activities, provide practical, safe, and efficient, comfortable mobility for vulnerable users, maintain and increase the modal share for non-motorized transport by making transit user experience easier and safer, and finally improves efficiency and safety of all transportation mode while minimizing environmental footprint. And how do we do that? And I told you that twice, so I'll show you. We've got top-down principle and bottom-up approach. When I talk about top-down principle, I'm talking about stronger institutional foundations. A road function hierarchy, that should be done at the government level, going down. Avoid inappropriate land use, making sure that the land use is coherent with the road use. Favor multimodal transport and improve space use for all users, making sure that everybody has a place, being a pedestrian, a cyclist, a motorcyclist, a commercial activity, and motorist, obviously. And on the other side, we go from the bottom up, developing a human-centric approach to road safety, making sure the human is at the center of what we do. The other one is shifting the focus away from motorized mode. Stop thinking that cars should be prevalent all over, making sure that it's human-centered. The other one is improve safety through ITS technology, if we can, and how we can implement it. The other one is implementing the 3 E's: education, engineering, and enforcement, making sure that they are well implemented. So some key rules to remember. Remember that vulnerable user is an extremely diversified group, and they've got different characteristics and limitation. We need to understand that and making sure that what we implement respect those limitations and characteristics. You should remember that VRUs have their own objective, and that's going to impact their decision and action. If they want to go from point A to B and the shortest path is crossing the road here, they're going to do it no matter what you do. So making sure that they can do it. And humans don't always do what we expect them to do. They do whatever they want. We should, they are human, and we should remember that. No matter what we put in place, they are going to be doing whatever they want. Human process information in serial manner. I told you that already. They can do one thing well at a time. Actually, it's funny because I do have 3 daughters who are, grown-up women now, and they tell me, well, women can do more than one thing at a time. Well, perhaps women can do it, but I cannot. So usually, I think people can do only one thing at a time. And people have expectation, so that's going to influence their behavior. So if we meet their expectation as designer, we are going to help them behave properly. Humans make mistake. So making a mistake should not result in injury or death. And I'll talk more about that in the next webinar, when we'll talk about Vision Zero and safe road and all of that, safe system approach. The infrastructure and the environment should send more information than any sign, signal, or marking. That's perhaps the most important point here. Just I got two more slides before I close, and I know I'm a bit late. I just want to tell you that something Brendan talked about, the UN Sustainable Development Goal for safety. So there are goals to improve safety, and I just put out something for the from their website. They want to reduce in half the global death injury from the road crash by 2020. That was the goal. And I got a few things here I want to show you. You don't have to read. There is a lot of things on the slide here, but let me show you what it's talking about. So they're going to be implementing action plan, legal tools, standards, engineering standard for new roads, by 2030, and standard for all roads. 75% of all roads, existing roads, should meet technical standard by 2030. Standard for vehicles, speed management, motorcycle helmets, seat belts, impaired driving, distracted driving, tracker resting time, and emergency response. I just wanted to show you this because I want to set up the table for the next webinar. That's what we'll be talking about, because road safety is not one element. It's not speed management or traffic calming devices. It's a global of aspect that we need to work on. And the objectives that you can see now on the slide is very, very it's very high. It's going to be difficult to meet, but we should aim at that. We should work at that, and we're in the right direction. So how do we achieve that? It's going to be it's going to require appropriate management capacity, effective institutional leadership, multi-sectorial coordination, sustainable funding, and data systems to be able to measure, target, and monitor. It's a strong goal, but I think we can make it, working together and properly. So I told you I would send you some references, and you'll get that presentation, so you have them. There are very good reference on general road safety made by PIARC, by AASHTO, by the American and some Canadian stuff also. I'm Canadian, so I'm always talking of what TAC is doing, the Transportation Association of Canada. But those are very good, and most of them are free on the web. You can go and download those manuals. Most of them are free, and you can download them. On human factors, a couple of good ones from from the Transportation Research Board, PIARC, and AASHTO as well. Those are quite interesting tools. And African ones, I suggest you download those ones. There are very good elements in there, and many of the pictures that I show you today are coming from those references here. You should be using, and those are made, for you, for your cities, for your context, and your reality, and it's very well done. So what's next? Today we saw the first webinar. Next one is going to be on March 8th. It's going to be establishing and evaluating municipal road safety strategies, and eventually we'll come to Accra for the workshop. Second webinar, we'll look at Vision Zero concept, what it is. We'll explore the framework and the safe system approach. We'll look at political requirements for implementation, KPIs, element of success, and I'll try to bring element from other cities. I'll try to show you example from Canada, Europe, and Korea. And we'll get some homework for the upcoming workshop in April. And I will let eventually Brendan tell you more about that. So to keep in mind, this is my last slide. I just have a few things to let you think about. The first one, and I think it's an important one, the situation actually in Africa today is not very good, but there are opportunities to change that. And that's in our hands, yours and mine, and we should work toward that. All decision, action, and design should be human focused. We should put the human at the center of all we do. VRU is an absolute priority, especially for Africa, knowing that most Africans are walking and using transit system. That should be an absolute priority. Speed management and control is a key element of our success. So we should focus on this more than on anything else, making sure that we control and manage speed. The other one is we should promote non-motorized transportation. So one way to promote that is provide them with safe and efficient systems, infrastructures. Road hierarchy must be better and clear for all users, and it should be respected. We should share best practices. And we got speakers and over. And once again, I would like to thank IRF for doing that. IRF is providing speakers like myself from all over the world, bringing their expertise and sharing them with you people to make sure you can do your stuff. To close, I would like to thank you because I know it's quite a challenge to make roads safer. But if we can save one life, we're making a difference. So thank you for working on that. Thank you for trying to do this. Brendan, I'm going to let you talk again. And before I do that, I would like to thank the interpreters. I realize I've been talking for more than an hour, most likely very fast. And I thank you for, I suppose you did a very good job. Brendan, the mic is yours.
Indeed, thank you. And thank you for, again, highlighting these summary points at the end. And I think to a large extent, they're reflective of this safe system approach that we all aspire to. We know that there are only relatively limited opportunities to change human behavior, whether it is at the road, the motorist, the driver of the vehicle, or even pedestrians, a cyclist, as you pointed out. No one needs a license or a special permit to be a pedestrian, and therefore there isn't necessarily always a correct appreciation of the level of road risk. And therefore it is our role to provide an overall system that accommodates for those human vulnerabilities. There was a number of interesting points, and it sounds like if we had another hour and a half, we would be able to kind of dig into a number of these engineering measures. In terms of sharing best practices and collaboration, again, I think you've also highlighted the value of the two webinars focusing on the engineering and planning measures this time, and then we will focus more on the kind of the leadership and the policy and stakeholder engagement issues. Africa has a very active NGO community as well, and a number of them are in fact participating in today's webinar, and there's an opportunity to leverage that kind of activism and the additional insights and strengths that they provide. I had a couple of thoughts, and we have some questions that have come in which relate very well to some of the points I wanted to raise. In a sense, a lot of the insights that you have shared would be, we heard earlier on that you have this very impressive graph showing how the dominant cities in 20-30 years, many of them will be located on the African continent. Entire new neighborhoods are being built up as we speak. It's quite phenomenal, the rate of growth of these cities. So there's an opportunity to apply a lot of these good practices from the ground up as these new neighborhoods are being designed. There's no excuse not to do that. Conversely, we also know that a number of challenges arise on the existing roads or within the existing neighborhoods, where maybe retrofitting some of these measures is a lot more complex for a number of reasons. And one of the questions we got related to this, for instance, this phenomenon, which we see a lot in Africa and some Asian countries and Latin America, where you've also worked, is the encroachment, for instance, of, let's say, vendor, activities on the roadway, thereby creating differentiated traffic speeds, for instance, as people slow down and maybe see kind of some I don't know, like a market stall that they want to stop at, and of course taken away from that portion of the pavement or the protected area next to the road, which would have been for pedestrians to effectively use that road safely, and now they're no longer able to do so. So do you have some particular thoughts in terms of again, how to kind of, taking into account these phenomenon, maybe how to kind of retrofit those measures onto existing roads with the, bustling kind of roadside trade, thriving foot and slow moving traffic and so on. We don't always find answers to those questions in the design handbooks, drafted in North America or Europe for that matter.
It's a very difficult question. It's a good one, Brendan, and I have seen it many times in different countries where I've been, where we were on national roads or freeways which were jam packed, and everybody was driving very slowly, and we could see all those vendors coming up and just walking, there, and actually it was kind of safe because traffic is so jammed and it's going so slowly that they just walk among the cars and sell oranges and water and all kind of stuff, and it's working. Actually, it's good business for them. But that should not be. Because the problem with this, if we let it go, is that people will do it no matter what the speed is. So they can do it when it's slow, but they will keep on walking on the road and going anywhere without understanding the hazard of the road. So my feeling, and it's very difficult to do, but my feeling is that they should not be allowed on those streets no matter what, even when it's jam-packed. But prohibiting is not the best option. The best option is to provide solution and then prohibit. So in one of the areas we've been working, there were a lot of commercial activities at one spot because there were very frequent traffic jams. And there was a bit of space, and what we decided to do is build up an area where they could build up a market, and with easy access from the road, and people could just go off the road and park and buy their fruits and water and just go back on the road. And they did set up a barrier that would prohibit vendors to go directly on the road. It did not work perfectly, but it did improve the situation a little bit. Once again, I'm going back to my 3 E's. I think educating people is also a good solution, and in those cases, enforcement. We should have police there and saying, if you go on the road, I'm going to give you a ticket, and you are not supposed to be walking on the road. So once again, it's I think it's not one element. It's going to be a combination of elements, and I fully agree with you. It's much easier said than done.
Thank you very much. So some additional questions that are coming in, and again, please use the chat, or raise your hand, and we will unmute you. And again, questions may be asked in English and in French. So a question that, of course, is not specific to the African engineering community, but nonetheless, it does kind of pose itself with perhaps a more pressing urgency in this regional context, which is really the idea that roads remain primarily designed to get people from point A to point B, as efficiently and as quickly as possible. And so within that context and within that kind of frame of mind, how do we introduce this kind of traffic calming as something that really should be kind of built into the design of roads, and that again, the traffic engineering and community should not simply address the question of the speed at which folks will be able to, use those specific or drive on those specific roads at?
It's another good question, and I think the answer is road hierarchy. I agree that roads are made. Some roads, I should say, are made to go from point A to B in as fast as possible, and those are focusing on mobility. But some other road are focusing on accessibility. It's accessing a point. And I think one of the issue that we have, perhaps more in Africa or in Latin America than in other countries, it's that there is not much difference in the road hierarchy. Very often, as I said, you got a national road that's crossing a village, and that's actually the only road available there. So what we should do is that before getting into the village, we should say, okay, you are on the national road, you are entering a village, so that's the getaway. We should do something that forces people to reduce speed. And even though the role of the road is mobility, at that point the role of the road is accessibility, because you've got access to vendors and schools and commercial activities and houses. So at that point the role of the road has changed, and because the function of the road is changing, the design should be changing as well. So I agree with the person who asked that question, is that we should be as efficient as possible, but we should have the right design for the right function. And sometimes you don't have any choice. When you get into a city, and I don't know if you when you travel, you go from point A to B, but you cross cities or villages, and when you cross a city, you got to reduce speed because the function of those roads are changing. And that's why in major cities, very often you got the national road is just going around it. You got peripheral freeways, or just to avoid crossing the street. If your destination is not the city itself, well, go around it. So that's why in many cities they are building bypass, and just to avoid mixing the functions. I don't know if my answer is clear, but the point is, if you got a good road hierarchy, you are going to solve that problem in good part.
Thank you very much. We'll take one final question, and I so encourage people. There have been some very interesting experiences, shared in different parts of Africa, and I'd like to take this opportunity to also thank Brima for her contribution, just highlighting, maybe giving us some insights into the situation in Gambia, where they are based. We'll take one final question, and then I would like to hand over to the African Development Bank for some additional kind of insights at their end. And I know that one of the questions, maybe you can start thinking about that, Jean-Francois, is, in a sense, a lot of these good practices still aren't coded, and as they relate to kind of an African urban context, are still not necessarily coded into design guidelines, into manuals, etc., and how we need to kind of think about that in order to ensure that it is that there is a new source of kind of reference, documents, reference manuals that Africa's up and coming engineering community can refer to. But before we get to that question, is also the link with the topic of maintenance, and you've kind of alluded to this on a number of occasions. First of all, who should be in charge of maintenance? Who should be in charge of thinking about road safety in the context of maintenance? Frequently, you have agencies that are just there to kind of handle the maintenance, the basic maintenance aspects, but don't necessarily have a safety mandate to do so. Are we missing an opportunity, perhaps, to kill two birds with one stone? We dive into kind of some more institutional arrangements issues, which maybe we'll be covering a little bit more at our next webinar next month, but maybe some initial thoughts, and then we can hand over to the African Development Bank for the whole kind of the legacy aspect and the design manuals focusing on African needs. Jean-François.
Thank you. Before I answer that question, I think we'll talk about Brendan, but if you can provide feedback, because I understand that people are sending you information and you get some feedback, that's going to be very helpful at the workshop in Ghana. You know, you'll talk more about it, Brendan, but I think it's important that at the workshop you will be bringing your own problems and solutions, and I'm looking forward to it actually, because it's not going to be me talking, but you people showing what kind of experience you have, and I think that's going to be very exciting. Anyway, going back to your question, who should be in charge? Once again, I do believe very much in collaboration. I think it's we're all responsible for doing things properly and efficiently. Obviously, government have a major role in there because they usually have funding to do so and doing properly. The only advice I can give about that, about maintenance, because I know it is a major issue and it's a concern. Uh, Perhaps my best advice would be to do things simply. I talked about technology a couple of times and leapfrogging, and I show you an example of, for example, electronic device that shows your speed. And at the same time, I show you that because I want you to know that it does exist, but that's something that I don't think would work in many African countries, because eventually it's going to break down. It's not going to be working. And so it's not going to be credible anymore. It's going to be counterproductive. So all of the interventions that you do, make sure that they're going to be sustainable in time. Build stuff that's easy to maintain, easy to replace, and low cost. That would be my best advice for that, because the question, and I really don't know how to answer it, who should be responsible of maintenance? Eventually, it requires funding, and one of the main issues of Africa, of course, is the lack of funding. So one way to solve this is to make it as low cost as possible. And there are many things that can be done at low cost. I can assure you that. You can do stuff that don't require a lot of maintenance when it's well designed. Very often maintenance is required because there is a design is not well done, or whatever. Um, I'm I'm not sure I'm answering you properly, so I give you back the mic, Brendan.
Thank you. And this is a topic we indeed need to continue, digging, as I said, this kind of interagency collaboration, and this as maybe as part of the next webinar. Neji, I think you are on the line, and if that is the case, you're very welcome to unmute yourself, maybe share some observations, and challenge us with this question of the design manuals. Neji, if you want to take a moment to unmute yourself and
Yes, yes. Oui, oui, je suis en ligne là. J'ai posé la question pour pouvoir probablement. On n'a pas ça. On n'a pas ça en Afrique, même dans les design des roads, on s'inspire souvent des normes françaises, certaines des normes anglaises, les anglophones, mais on n'a pas de manuel précis pour les pays africains, et principalement surtout pour la question des routes urbaines et du trafic. Du design de tout ce qui est trafic calming dans les zones urbaines. Quand on traverse une zone urbaine, même avec une route nationale ou une autoroute, on a des difficultés à se retrouver pour ces questions. Mais là, on se rend compte qu'effectivement, il y a beaucoup de problèmes de sécurité dans nos villes. Et les voies sont designées de façon comme en race campagne. On ne prend pas en compte les caractéristiques urbaines, les usagers, les problèmes de modes vulnérables et tout ça. Probablement, oui, la banque va penser à développer des manuels probablement un peu généraux pour donner les grandes lignes pour le design des routes urbaines. On aura besoin de vos expertises, certainement. On va y penser. Moi, je pense que c'est une bonne idée pour pouvoir mettre ça à la disposition des différents usagers, les ministères de transport, les ministères des travaux publics, tous ceux qui sont en charge de tout ce qui est route. Je pense que c'est une bonne idée. Hein. On va y penser. Hein. On va y penser. Merci.
Oh, sorry, I was just looking for the unmute button. So just a very I think a very justified observation by a colleague from the African Development Bank that a lot of what we have discussed, these best practices that we are seeing in other parts of the world and that we are starting to see in Africa as well, need to be coded into engineering practices. And it's very encouraging to hear that the African Development Bank is indeed beginning a process of perhaps consolidating expertise and know-how around this. I think that this could be a very valuable reference guide for the region, in the same way that your manuals on safety audits and inspections a few years back actually made a significant impact in the generalization of and the mainstreaming of these preventive practices. I see it's getting a little late, and we are behind our schedule. I think we've given you a good insight into what to look forward to for our next webinar with Jean-François, which I hope all of you will attend again, and which will take place on March the 8th, so just 1 month from now. We will, of course, be sharing the full recording, the proceedings, and indeed, some of the comments that have come through the chat. And again, all of this will inform our process in terms of designing, effective and useful workshops as part of the regional congress in Accra in April. I see many colleagues joining us from Accra and Kumasi for that matter, and I want to welcome them in particular. And I know that we will certainly be seeing all of you in April as well. And with this said, I want to extend a special thanks to Jean-François. There's a lot of content there. Granted, there aren't necessarily the African design guidelines that you were referencing, but there are some very good reference manuals produced by the World Roads Association and other organizations. All of these will be provided, and they do provide nonetheless a good basis to establish traffic calming strategies on. So with this, I'd like to thank everyone again for staying on, for joining us from different parts of Africa. And it was a pleasure seeing so many countries represented. And Jean-François, we will be seeing you again in a month's time, and we look forward to a discussion really on that will take us beyond these kind of engineering questions into, again, the political leadership, the policy framework, and of course the institutional questions, including how to work effectively with non-governmental stakeholders and the private sector as well, who can all be key partners in achieving safer roads for African cities. So with this, thank you very much, everyone. We have formally come to an end, and I wish you a great and safe rest of the day. Thank you.
Merci Vandan, merci Jean-François, et merci à tous nos collègues de tous les pays qui sont là. C'est excellente présentation, Jean-François. Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Merci énormément, Nadji.
Merci.
Bonne journée à vous.
Bonne journée, bonne fin de semaine. Bientôt.
Bientôt.